Howdy! This is the Fat Psychic, also known as Mark Fults. I am here to introduce you to my new project, the Chattanooga Chills Online Ghost Tour. When I lived in Chattanooga, which was most of my life, I had put together a tour based on stories I've been collecting over the last 40 years. And as fate would have it, I had to move to Florida, or got to move to Florida. I did not want to lose this tour, so I'm putting it into this format so that I can go in depth into the stories and you can watch it in the comfort of your home, on your couch, on your chaise lounge, or even sitting at your dinner table. As a matter of fact, you can have dinner and invite people over and watch this show to see the dark side of Chattanooga's history that is not in any history book I've ever seen. Now, there is another tour in Chattanooga. It's called Chattanooga Ghost Tour. It's owned by Amy Petula. It is a separate entity. It is a walking tour. So if you are interested in a walking tour, please contact Amy Petula. And if you are interested in this tour, it is always Chattanooga Chills Ghost Tour by Mark Fults. And I also want to say that this video is not a license for you to violate the law or to irritate any of the businesses in Chattanooga. The ones that I speak of are businesses, and I am very careful not to intrude upon them. Any of the stories, like the hotel rooms, I rented the hotel rooms to investigate, and also I got permission to investigate the room 311, which is their most famous story to look at. So please be polite, and there is a parking lot that I speak of in this tour, and again, it is owned by a separate entity, so look at it, but please do not trespass. And just be polite and businesslike, and if you have questions, please ask them. And I hope that you and yours have a good time. Sit back, relax, and let's dip into the dark side of Chattanooga. So here we go. Follow me. I believe whatever we touch and wherever we live is forever embedded with thoughts, energy, and emotions. The remaining essence is intangible, but pervasive, a sense of all that has ever been, abiding in our homes and our places of work, worship, and play. Like a murmur, the past speaks to us in tones so hushed, it is nearly inaudible. A psychic is someone who may act as a translator of information that he or she perceives on someone else's behalf. Psychic extrasensory advantages are more a little extra talent and experience in keeping the senses open to the surrounding environments. Tonight, I am your psychic tour guide, and I will lead you down the foggy streets of the past, sometimes intersecting with the future and the present. So follow me, and let our journey begin. Chattanooga is the third largest city in Tennessee and has more reason than many other cities to shelter a multitude of ghosts. It contains Ross's Landing, the starting point of the Cherokee Nation's Trail of Tears from this area. This city was assigned to some of the bloodiest battles of the war between the states, including the Battle of Chickamauga and the Battle above the Clouds. The city was occupied by the Yankees, a portion of the war between the states. The stories I'm about to tell you are a blend of urban legend, personally investigated ghost stories, and true tales of strange and sometimes frightening worlds. They will appeal to the ghost junkies, and you know who you are, and those who just enjoy a good ghost story. So come along with me, and I will tell you stories that are destined to chill you on cold and moonless nights. I will take you with me into a world that lies beyond the dark veil, which sometimes parts and reveals an odd but eerily familiar landscape filled with shades and mirror images of ourselves. Always remember, we are all ghosts waiting to escape our shells, waiting to part the dark veil and sleep no more. Now, to set the mood for the upcoming stories, I want you to look to your right across the street where you see the bronze glass building. That's 200 block of MLK, and where that is, there's a plaque that says the Union Station. Now, during the war between the states, when the Yankees came and took over town, they took over the train station that was there, and I have a picture of the train station not too long after the war, just to let you get a feeling of what it looked like here. Now, where we're standing on the corner of Chestnut, if you turn around and look at the building behind you, I'm going to show a picture of what used to be here at that time as well. And it was called Sutler's Row. And what a Sutler's Row was, it was an encampment that would follow the army camps, and they would set up stores and saloons and brothels with lots of hussies for the soldiers. Anything that they wanted, they could get. And they also became places of high crime. This was what was here on the corner in 1864. It was very fascinating to look into the history and see. So now, the first story we're going to have is going to be from the Chattanooga Times, May 13th, 1881, page 3. And the article is Ghastly Discoveries. 2 coffins found 3 feet under a house. So what the article says is John Gallimore, who was hired to dig a sewer trench under the Montague block of frame storehouses on 8th Street, just east of the Presbyterian Church. Chattanooga was prone to a lot of flooding in those days, and so there was about 3 feet of water under these houses. John Gallimore was hired to dig a sewer trench. So while he's digging, by candlelight, now mind you, because this is 1881, and he strikes something with his pick. At first, when he digs it up, he thinks it's a box, but when he starts to really look at it, he realizes he has dug up a coffin. So it scares him to death, and he runs out of there, and he goes to his boss, Mr. Harry McQuaid, and tells him about what he's discovered. So they notify the coroner, Then they decided that it probably wasn't necessary, that it was an older coffin. There was a reporter from the Times that came on the scene, and while they were looking at that coffin, John Gallimore went about his business continuing to dig the trench. And when they opened the coffin, they thought it was probably the coffin of about a 12-year-old child. The bones were so fragile that they just crumbled to dust if you touched them. There wasn't any identification. They were looking at it, and the coffin was made with 4 nails. So it was made very cheaply, or very whatever someone had it on hand. And while they were looking at this coffin, about 3 feet away from where that one had been found, he struck another coffin. And this one was an adult-sized one. So here are 3 ideas they had at the time of what could be behind these coffins. The Presbyterian church that was down the street was used as a hospital and a morgue during the Civil War. So it could have been someone from that. But when they realized that one of them is a child, they didn't think that was the answer. They thought, well, maybe it was people who were killed on Settlers Row, because someone died almost nightly there during the 1800s when the Settler Row was there during the war. The other one is there was a Mrs. Ellis and her son who died during the siege during the war, and that they were buried under the house. A lot of times when people would do that, they would, after the war, they would relocate their loved one to a cemetery. But if they were killed or died during the war, then the people just stayed buried in the yard or buried under the house. So it more than likely was Mrs. Ellis and her child. They have been buried there since the siege during the Civil War. And this is just our first story, and it deals with the dead being buried where we're standing nearly. And it gives you a good idea of what to expect further on. I have multiple, and I mean multiple, stories of when they do construction work, either near the river or in the streets, that they find bones. Either bones from the Indians, or remains from the Civil War, or old cemeteries that have been forgotten. So there is hardly a place in Chattanooga downtown that you can throw a rock that a dead person hasn't been laying there, and that is a fact. Now, I'd like for you to look across the street and look at the Reed House. It is a beautiful shining jewel in the crown of paranormal phenomena here in Chattanooga, and we wear that crown proudly. Now, some of the history of the Reed House is it has a long history of fatal illness and sudden premature death. First known as the Crutchfield House, it opened for business in 1847. It was the first building occupied by the Union forces during the Civil War, and was converted into a Union hospital and morgue in 1863. The hotel survived the war only to burn in 1867. Dr. John T. Reed built on the original building's foundation in 1872. The building witnessed the cholera epidemic of 1873, the flood of 1875, and the outbreak of yellow fever in 1878. In 1926, the present hotel was decorated with old world beauty and grandeur, but after its history of disease and death, more than a few specters have decided to call it home. Now, just to kick off some of the spooky stuff at the Reed House, I'm going to show you a little bit of a article I found of a seance being held by a spiritualist psychic or two in room 18 in 1883, May 8th, Chattanooga Times, a spiritualistic seance. And a guy named Thomas Kinsey, R.G. Houston, and J.W. James had a sitting with a slate writing. So what that was is they had a slate board like you used for school back in the old days, and a piece of chalk, and they would put it under the table or hold it somewhere where they couldn't write on it, and you would hear writing being done by a spirit. In this case, the one they were using was named Billy Moore, and he wrote messages to them in front of a Times reporter. They tested the spirit by asking about an old friend who they hadn't seen in a while, who the spirit said, well, he's in Nashville, and he's playing the races, and won. They didn't know there were races going on in Nashville. Of course, this is 1881. There was no radio, no phone. So they went and got the paper together with the reporter and checked the races thing, proved that the spirit was saying whatever it was saying was truthful. So it's not like a great in-depth story, but it shows that the spiritualists were and psychics were doing readings at the Reed House a long time ago. So not even just accounting for the spooky stuff of dead soldiers or the ghost in 311, because there are stories about people believe that the ghost in 311 is a prostitute who was killed by a soldier from the Civil War, or it could be a woman who had been a prostitute working out of the Reed House in the 40s that was murdered. And then, of course, we're going to cover my story. So this is just to show you there was strange stuff going on at the Reed House many, many moons before all of this even came to be. Now I am going to commence on telling my story of the ghost of 311. Now, before I investigated, here were some stories that I knew beforehand. There was a man named Gordon who worked there who one night had to go pick up a long, tall, gangly, rich oil man from Texas. And he picked him up in the guy's limo and brought him to the hotel, and the guy checked into room 311. And very shortly, he came running out of the elevator in his cowboy hat, his boxer shorts, and his cowboy boots, scared to death, and he would not go back up to the room. And he told Gordon, "Get my limo." And Gordon said, "Why?" And he said, "I'm getting out of here." He would not go back up, and Gordon had to go get all of the man's luggage to get him out of there. He couldn't get out quick enough. Another story is there was a family who stayed in the room. The wife scared the husband half to death because she was screaming her head off because a black-haired lady stood there and was staring at her with an evil look. They made them move them to another room. There are all sorts of little stories that happen with that. So, in November 1998, Frank Riddle rented the room, and Judith Anderson and I went to investigate. And when I went into the room, when you go in, there's a little alcove to the right. So I sensed that she was in the little alcove. Sometimes spirits come in and out of little energy spots. So we put a table in the hallway to have a seance to communicate with her. And she really did not want to talk. She was really not a happy camper. So when she did talk, she told me to move that blankety-blank table and where I could stick it. And that was the first time that had ever happened to me with a spirit. I talked to her and tried to calm her down and got a little bit of her story eventually because she knew I wasn't going to give up. She said that her name was Martha Brown Hewlett and that she had lived in the Reed House permanently in the 40s because she had been married to a man for 20 years. He ended up having a mistress. She didn't want to get a divorce. She thought, well, why should that hussy get all the benefits of the money while I had to put up with his behavior? He put her up in the Reed house to live by herself. That was cheaper than getting a divorce. And she enjoyed it. She had her friends come over and they play bridge and do stuff like that. She didn't like very many people. But she had a good time. And then one night, while she was sitting there after eating supper and had drank some bourbon, she had a heart attack. After that, she just wanted to live there. So she comes back and forth when she wants to, and if someone's there that she doesn't want in her space, she scares them. It works very efficiently. I asked her if she wanted to go into the light to go on into the next layer or dimension, and she said, I didn't like them when I was alive. Why would I want to be with them when I'm dead? I'm going to tell you her description. She was dark-haired, had a very pretty late 30s, early 40s, flared black dress, very stylish. You could see her French manicure and the beautiful little bracelet she had on her wrist. She was so solid looking. She just looked like a regular person. Very pretty, but of course she had a little bit of a potty mouth. She was a smoker and a drinker, kind of like a socialite from that era. We finished up that investigation, and about a year later, we again came to the room to film a show for WTCI's Southern Accents. They did a Halloween show, and they wanted us to do the Reed House and the Hunter Art Museum. So we came to the room. The people that were there with us were very nervous. Workers would come by when I stayed there before and would talk to us through the door, but they wouldn't come into the room. So while we're in there, they had a man named Howard Johnson who had worked there 30 years at that time, and he came up and told his story, but he refused to come into the room. But one Saturday, he said he was watching a football game in the unrented room, and he said that there was a woman at the door when he turned around, and he thought she wanted to know the score for the football game. So he started talking to her, telling her what was going on. She didn't say anything and kept staring at him, and then he realized she was rather odd looking and rather old-fashioned looking, and then he realized it was the ghost. And she was so solid that he had to go around her to get out the door. While he was there, I showed him a picture that I had drawn of her from my first investigation there, and he screamed, "That's her! That is her!" So I had confirmation from someone who saw her in person. I go with my investigation, which is Martha Brown Hewlett. She's there. She doesn't want to be bothered. That's just her home. If you want to investigate, if she doesn't like you, she's going to give you a rough time. So if that's what you're after, you may get it. When we were there, Judith practiced the legend of lighting matches because she doesn't like people to smoke. Judith was striking matches and they would go out, and the spirit told me to tell her she burned her damn fingers. She didn't like it that other people could smoke and she couldn't, so she does not like it. It is her home. Be prepared. Try not to irritate her too much, but she is there. It's her home. You're on her space, so try and give her a little leeway. Now, before we finished up with our first investigation of room 311, some people came by the door named Wayne and Candace, who worked there in the hotel, And they had stories to tell me that, they'd been in there before and the water would turn on and off by itself. The doors would open and close by themselves. They wouldn't come in the room just like the other people, but they told me about the stories. And Candace said, and to room 713 is haunted. And so I made a mental note that I wanted to come back and investigate 713. But it turned out it would be almost 20 years until I could do that. I just had no idea. But after all the investigations in the 90s, I used to go to a little junk store, and there was a file of old prints I bought, and I wanted this really cool picture of a horse that I wanted, and I didn't really look at the other clippings too closely, and because I saw one that said something about Gideon Bibles, so I went, oh, and I put it to the side, and it was almost 20 years before I really picked it up and looked again when I was moving, and I was going through it, looking at all the clippings, and lo and behold, in the file, there was a clipping, the one with Gideon Bibles, or about Gideon Bibles. It was about a man who committed suicide by jumping out of the 7th floor of the Reed House. That they thought the reason was because there wasn't a Gideon Bible in the room, and if there had been, he wouldn't have committed suicide. So that's what that was about. But out of all of the people in Chattanooga, for that clipping to come to me and for me to sit on it all that time and not know that I had it, really, you could have knocked me over with a feather. But the reason turned out it wasn't quite time to do the investigation at that time. So when I found that, I went and I looked up his death certificate. The name of the man on the clipping was David K. Farrell. And so I found the death certificate. And on the death certificate, where it says cause of death, homicide, suicide, natural, it had a question mark. Now, if you go head first out of a window on the 7th floor, there shouldn't be a question mark on suicide. Unless, of course, they had proof of something else. But there was a question mark. So I immediately saw that this was a mystery. And the spirit was trying to lead me there by giving me the clipping. And now I had the death certificate. So I went and looked up the date, which was in November 1952. And I found front page, man, dies from 7-story plunge. It had not only the picture of them putting him into the ambulance to go to the morgue, they had a diagram, a picture of the hotel and a diagram of where he came from. So immediately I didn't have to guess what room this happened. I was working with a friend named Storm at the time, and he was a wonderful videographer. I mean, just did beautiful work. I said, I'm going to rent the room. Let's do an investigation. So I needed 2 friends to come help me, and I convinced Sheila Albert to come and assist me, and my friend Cynthia Brundage, and to help me with my spiritualistic communication devices, because I'm very old school, and they were kind enough to come and help me. We began filming in room 717. 715 and 717 are the main rooms I feel like are haunted. And 713 is associated with it, as I found out during the investigation. We're sitting there doing the seance, and about 14 minutes into it, while I'm trying to connect to David K. Farrell, there are other spirits that come through. 2 spirits, one named Carol and one named Butch. What I found out from David K. Farrell when I communicated with him, that he had been partying with these people. He was from out of town. He'd been partying with them. He owed them money. And Butch was demanding he give them the money for them partying. David thought, well, they were partying with me. You know, I don't owe them any money. He didn't think he owed them money and didn't think the threat was very serious. So on that morning, what happened is Carol and Butch came over, and Butch stunned David by hitting him in the head with the gun. And what people were seeing from below on the street is they saw a screen fall. They looked up and saw him slowly come out the window without making a sound, and then fall 7 stories and land on his back. But what David said was happening was Butch pushed the screen out. He got behind David and lowered him out the window, and they couldn't see him from below on the street. He murdered him to make an example of him. They are still haunting just as David was. I asked those spirits why they're haunting. Carol, she was basically working with Butch. He was her pimp, basically. And later on, he killed her. And then later on, Butch was killed in a drug deal. So all of this violence, just glued them there to that room. And David was upset because one of the reasons he was haunting is because his family thought he had committed suicide. Storm later on brought me these pictures of that he said he communicated with David's family, with nieces, because apparently the parents are dead. Of course, it's been forever. And the nieces that he talked to said that they loved him as an uncle. When he committed suicide, the family was very upset because they were Catholic. Now, I went to school with and dated a girl who was Catholic who committed suicide. They consider it a bad death. If you didn't know where that girl is buried, you wouldn't know she ever existed because the family kind of hid her. And that's what happens. They get buried unconsecrated, just kind of, they disappear. So with David, his parents, apparently the niece said that during the funeral, the hearse stayed outside of the church with the casket. It did not come into the church. That's what Storm told me. He was just buried and there was no ceremony to look at him or anything. That was it. He was gone. If that is the story, then that is the reason for him to be worried about his parents thinking that he committed suicide. And Storm said the niece said that was a relief to know that he did not commit suicide. So that made it a lot better. The parents would have been glad to know that. Even though it was a tragedy and he was murdered, they would have been glad that he didn't commit suicide. So David was, I felt, able to move on. He can come back if he wishes. But the ones that you will encounter at the Reed House in room 717 are Butch and Carol. And on the video, which is on YouTube called The Secrets of the Reed House, about 14 minutes in, when I'm talking to Carol, you can see a mist going across the screen when she comes and talks. Also, you could smell jungle gardenia, which quite a beautiful scent, very expensive. So, very unique haunting. If you go there to investigate them, they are still there. They don't want to go on. They don't want to go into the next thing and be punished, is what they think. They are there, but they are very ruthless spirits. David, if he comes back, he has the ability to come back. But I'm hoping that he's moved on and found peace at last. Now, as we are leaving the Reed House and all its dead people, we are going to turn to your left, go down, and turn to the right in between the buildings between the Reed House and what's next to it, and that is 8th Street. So we will be going to Broad Street. And as we are traveling through this alleyway, I will tell you about the black dogs. Now, I found a article called A Ghost at Large, and it was the November 1903, page 5. And Douglas and 8th Streets terrorized by a headless dog. And what this story was about is at a school for African American children in 1903. Robert Bruce Falls told me that there was a school called Parkman School, and this would be the one they're talking about. That at this school, for 2 months, there had been a sighting on the steps of the school at night, a headless black dog. And if you approached it, it cried like a child. So one of the neighbors decided to come out and shoot it, and they shot it with a shotgun, and it screamed a hair-raising scream. And the person who had the gun dropped his weapon. He ran with his hair straight up in a perpendicular stance as he ran away. After that, other neighbors tried the same thing, and they said that the dog would chase them, and they didn't know how far because they were too scared to turn around and look. So at the end of this, they said the police were called and they would investigate. And that was where that story sort of ended. So now, what we got to look at is, what does it mean to have a headless dog? Okay, black dogs are omens. They can be guardians, they can be guides, but more than likely it was something there to protect the children, since it was at a specific spot. Now, there are all sorts of legends in metaphysics about black dogs, and they are associated with Hecate. They are protectors of the underworld, and they're very mysterious. And I have a story of a black dog. When I was young, I went with a friend, Jeff Allen, and we went to investigate this cemetery at like 2:30 in the morning. And it was a fascinating cemetery. But we saw several ghosts. I mean, women standing at windows of the mausoleums and things moving around. But there was one mausoleum that is in particular scary. And while we were looking into the mausoleum, you could see this black figure running around, watching us from tree to tree, from cemetery stone to cemetery stone. And he goes, "There's a black dog watching us." And I said, "Black dogs don't walk on 2 feet." And it was about 2 feet tall, walking on 2 feet. And it was sneaking back and forth between the headstones. And that is what we in metaphysics call a fetch. So it belonged to whatever was in the mausoleum. That was a fetch they had created, that when they died, it was still watching for them and bringing information, even though they were deceased. So they can be guardians and be gatherers of information. In old days, when they would build a new building or they would make a new cemetery, the first thing to be interred in the cemetery would be a black dog to protect the souls of the people inside the cemetery. And they would put black dogs under the stone of the original building to protect the building and the people within it. So they were used in the old days to protect in a spiritual aspect, to guard whoever was going to be in it. So this dog at the school must have been protecting the children from some danger that was happening or coming up, because usually it happens as an omen, a sense of an omen before something happens. I would have to research what happened around 1903. I know that there were some things that happened in 1906. Without further evidence or examination, I can just speculate. But it was a very unusual event, very obvious, something to get people's attention, and something that could explain the headless part is in Chattanooga, around Chattanooga, the last of the Revolutionary War was fought in the Missionary Ridge area, and there were French soldiers here in this area. And one thing that they did back in that era for good luck, they would use the skull of a black dog to rub on the haunches of their horses for good luck. Good luck for them, bad luck for the dog. But all I can say is if you see a black, headless dog that screams like a child, run, girl, run. Now that we are on Broad Street, you kind of look to your left and you will see the grand and beautiful little jewel box of a theater called the Tivoli. It is a beautiful landmark that has been here many, 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 many years. My experience with the Tivoli was back in 1981, I believe. I was about 19 years old. I was in a production that was in the Tivoli for one night only. And it probably was the biggest stinker that has ever graced that beautiful place. And it wasn't because of the actors or the dancers or the singers. It just was one of those stinkers that you could not wash away the stink. It had to be the worst thing that ever played there. And I cannot even remember the name of it. So that's how bad it is. Or I've blocked it from my memory. But one good thing that happened to me while I was there is I got to hang out in the dressing room area and the makeup area. And I was still very young, a young psychic, and my skills weren't really as developed as now, but I could still pick up stuff. I could tell there was a man named Charles Schwartz, that's the name I picked up, that haunted the dressing rooms. About 10 years later, I was told that they were haunted when they were remodeling it, and they wondered if it would remodel the ghost out of existence. But what I remember of the ghost is he was harmless, but he did hang out in that area. He had something to do with the Tivoli. I don't know if he worked there or raised money for it or something, but he did mention something that I think it's from the 40s, of a incident where some guys did like a smoke bomb thing to be funny, and it ended up being much stronger, and it scorched the floor. It was like an explosion instead of, just a funny thing to do. And I think the police were involved. So, and these people didn't tell about it until much, much, much later. He was around that period. He was around whenever that happened. So, he's harmless, but of course, if you're a lady, you might want to cover yourself a little better when you're in the dressing room, because Charles is around. But every beautiful theater needs to have a ghost, to have character, and that one has plenty of character to go around. So when you go to the Tivoli, watch for the movies, but also watch for Charles. The next ghost story we're going to tell is at 7th and Broad, and we're going to stand here and look towards Broad Street going west. And really, from the area that we started from down there by the Reed House, down just a block. But we're going to stay here on Broad Street and talk about this, because this is a great ghost story. Because I have several articles that are separate, but that go together with this story. It's great. This article is from Chattanooga Times, November 29th, 1886. Saw a ghost. Ed Cooper, a young man who fires engine number 35 on the Cincinnati Southern Railway, had a singular experience a few nights since. He boards on East Montgomery Avenue near the Rossville Road, but in going to the shops, he always goes on Market Street. Having to go out on his run shortly after midnight, a few nights since, he arose about 1 a.m. and started to the roundhouse. He was passing just in front of the Miller and Gormany's store at the head of Market Street, deeply absorbed in thought, when suddenly he saw a shadow nearby, and looking up, he claims that a ghost in the shape of a man was standing in front of him. He says the ghost was a giant in size, being fully 8 feet tall. It was clad in garments as white as snow, had long white hair and a beard. Cooper surveyed the ghost for a moment, and then it slowly disappeared from sight. When he reached the roundhouse, he was breathless and deeply pale, and the perspiration stood out in beads on his face. He protests that he was not mistaken. Now, when they talk about Miller and Gormany, later on that became Miller's store, which was there for ages. The reason I'm adding this story in is because that tall, white-robed figure is involved in another ghost story. So, hold on to your hats. Here we go. The next part of the story is Horrid Specters, 1887. The story of mysteriousness of which has created 1,000 fantastic theories and aroused the curiosity and superstitions of over 200 people who came to stare at the house where an amazing experience had happened. A reporter had been contacted by a Dr. Coball, whose office is at 729 Chestnut Street between 7th and 8th. The story he told was about a house at 727 Chestnut Street that Saturday night about 11 o'clock. But he was sitting in his office door, and he saw 2 forms pass his office, one in pursuit of the other, apparently trying to escape. He saw the strange phantom-like forms as they crossed Broad Street at a rapid rate of speed, and then they disappeared behind his office. He grabbed a lamp and went outside into the yard and made a thorough search, but did not find a trace of the men or whatever they were. The reporter was then referred to the house at 727 Chestnut to get the continuation of the story. At that house, at 11 o'clock Saturday evening, a large amount of family members were seated on the porch, and strange as it was, a man was telling some ghost stories when suddenly there was a large noise came from the rear of the house. The young man who had been telling the blood-curdling stories leaped to his feet and exclaimed, "Now for an adventure!" So everyone ran in to see what all the commotion was about, and when they reached the dining room, a tall figure which seemed to grow taller and taller stood before them clothed in a long white robe, the spirit that had been seen in 1886. One long arm measuring 3 feet in length was outstretched, and the fingers of the hand were dripping with blood, which left no stain upon the floor. The crowd stood motionless for several minutes, paralyzed with fear and horror, and unable to speak. After a few moments of the most intense and painful silence, a gentleman of the crowd leapt forward and attempted to seize hold of this intangible shadow. But just as the former reached the spot, the shadow waved across the room and disappeared to the window, which was closed and locked. After that, the terrified crowd spread the stories, and a crowd of over 200 people gathered to see if they could see the ghost. Apparently, the house was frequented by ghosts of another shadowy being, and it was a great difficulty to get a servant to be induced into the dining room after nightfall. No crap. So, for a while, the houses here were a very good tour shop for ghost watching. Just by chance, I found an article from 1930 about life in the 1870s, and the article was called "The Haunted House, Fresh in Mrs. Pickens' Memory." This was the memory of she was a little girl at that time, but their house was basically butted up to the 727 Chestnut Street house. And she gave a very colorful explanation of life there, and it was very interesting. But the very most important phrase that she said was, "I almost forgot to talk about the Hanks." And when she was a little girl, that house was known to be haunted in 1872. She would get the servants to take her hand and take her to see if she could see the headless women that were reported to be walking around that property. I have 3 articles talking about ghosts at 727 and 729 Chestnut. There's something going on that property back then. And it could have been something from the Civil War. Of course, that was where Settlers Row was. And it could have been murdered women. Could have been, there were brothels. So those could be where some of the murdered prostitute stories come from. Because maybe those are murdered prostitutes. And their ghosts were walking around headless on that property. So one can only ponder upon the past. But I love that ghost story, and I hope you do too. Now we're going to cover another story that's very complex, but I found an article, August 14th, 1904, Chanukah Times. It's called "The Ghost of Buddy Wooden, Very Busy at County Jail. The Prospect of Another Hanging Said to Have Wraith Worried. Prison Superstitions and Stories." So what was happening in 1904 is there was a gentleman named Alex Amore who was going to be hanged. In the jailhouse, the prisoners kept seeing this spirit walking around, this thin gray wraith, as they called it, moaning and walking around the gallows. What the superstition was at that time was that when someone else is going to be hung, the last person that had been hung would have to give up their spot because they were still haunting that, and that at least gave them a little freedom. After the other person takes their place, they would have to go back to wherever they came from, and they didn't like it. So they believed that it was the ghost of Buddy Wooten, who had been hung in 1892. He was having to come from hell or wherever it was they thought he was coming from to haunt Alex Amore because they were unhappy. I dug a little deeper, and then I uncovered a whole bigger story. here we go. Now, in November 27th, 1892, Buddy Wooten, not Wooten, they misspelled it a lot. In any article I found, they have gotten his name wrong several times. But in 1892, it was spelled Wooden. There was a bar owner named Marion Ross, who someone broke in, knocked him in the head, robbed him, and he died. Now, what happened back then is people could just say, well, I saw so-and-so and near that area, and you would get arrested. And they didn't have to have proof that you were the one who did it. So someone came up with the name and said, well, Buddy Wooten was in the neighborhood. So they went and arrested Buddy Wooten. In Buddy Wooten's house, in his bed, him and George Mapp were sleeping together. And they dragged Buddy Wooten out of there. George Mapp took off. They got a confession out of Buddy, but knowing the 1800s, they probably beat it out of him, because there are quite a few people who were hung for things that I believe the confessions were coerced, and Buddy Wooten was fairly young. And so they made him say who his accomplice was. He said it was George. So they searched for George for about 6 months. Sheriff Hyde made it a big deal to go find him. They caught George Mapp. Now, they had a confession out of Buddy Wooten, but like I said, it's kind of one of those things. I kind of had this feeling that it was coerced. Being a psychic, I would have to say that. They both were condemned. Buddy Wooten is the one that was thought to be haunting the jail later on. But I think it is George Mapp. Because Buddy Wooten was very sedate. He had priests coming in because he was Catholic and reading for him and speaking with him, and he was prepared to go. George Mapp was furious, and on the day of the execution, he was cursing everyone. He was saying, "Throw my body in the river and let it float to hell." Or he would say, "Any of you that have conspired to condemn me, I'll see you in hell." When he was leaving the jail, he told the other prisoners, "Goodbye, boys, see you in hell." And he had a thing about hell. He also had met a girl while he was in jail named Ella Kemp, and he made a big deal of saying, "Send Ella Kemp my derby and my jacket," which, after the execution, she put a feather in the hat and would go to the bars and things that she would go to, or gathering places, and she was treated like a celebrity for at least a year, wearing that hat with a feather in it, because he made such a big deal in front of everyone, in front of the Times reporters. She was a big deal for a while. They got them to the scaffold, and Buddy had two priests that were praying with him. George Mapp was cursing everyone that was there. And then his last words on his lips was to Sheriff Hyde, and he said, "I will be back. I will see you in hell." The way they did it, they had 6 men with 6 ropes to pull the scaffolding, so nobody would know who actually triggered the hanging. And they pulled the cord on cue. The floor dropped out from beneath them. Buddy died instantly, and George Mapp strangled to death. Even though they thought that Buddy Wooten was the one haunting the jail, I would bet you my brass buttons is George Mapp, because he went out angry with a reason. I think it's him who haunts the old jail. Now, when I was young, that was in the old jail, we were taken in on tours from schools to see the old jail, see the old gallows before it was torn down in the 70s. It was very scary at that time. Very scary. I remember seeing the gallows room. It's very creepy, very haunted place. And they built a new building, but I'm sure they have inherited the ghost of George Mapp. What we need to look at as well is on the corner of 6th and Broad is a parking space that is a privately owned parking lot with fencing around it. But on the Broad Street side, if you look at the very corner of 6th and Broad and look at the corner and look down inside, you'll see the old stone foundation. And what that was from was the old Franklin Funeral Home that was there for many, many, many years. That was the funeral home that George and Betty's bodies were taken to after the hanging. The people who owned it, someone started charging people a nickel for a peep to be able to see the dead bodies of the hanged men. The police came, shut that down. But that funeral home, that was where that funeral home was located. And at night, if you take pictures outside of that spot, sometimes you'll get weird anomalies. I've got a picture there that Sheila Albritton sent me from our first tour that I did. And you get odd pictures of the light or just strange things, because the foundation of the funeral home is made with stone, and stone holds frequency, and if it has any kind of quartz in it, if you remember quartz tubes and stuff like that from TVs, they hold frequencies and send frequencies. So it would record all of that stuff from back then. So that little corner is part of the old funeral home, part of a lot of trauma, part of a lot of sadness and upset. Take your pictures, but do not trespass on the parking lot. Just be very careful and respectful. And see if you get any pictures. And if you do, share them with us and let us see what has happened for you. This is one of my favorite haunted houses stories in Chattanooga. Sibling Choices, from an article in the Chattanooga Star in 1907. On the corner of 4th and Cherry stood an old building known as the Lee House. Built during the 1800s, the sturdy brick home housed workers with large families. During the Civil War, one of General Wilder's, the same general the tower is named for in the Chickamauga battlefield, one of his shells struck and killed a child standing on the corner sidewalk and then tore through the front end of the house. For years, it was known as a haunted house. People would gather and stare at the dark windows, hoping for a glimpse of the supernatural. The original house had been rented at one time by an old bachelor and his sister. One day, for unknown reasons, the brother committed suicide in his den with a shotgun stuck between his knees and parts of his skull and brain scattered on the walls. Nobody knew why he had taken his life. His gray, dead eyes kept the secret to the grave. His sister continued living in the brick house, and one night before retiring, she placed a kerosene lamp on a small table near her bedside so that she might read a chapter from her Bible. One leg of the table rested on her nightdress, and as she rose to retire, the table overturned and the lamp exploded, burning the woman to death. The sister's faceless and sometimes headless apparition was to be seen desperately trying to escape the fire, seeking a way out of her terrifying last moments as she fought desperately for her life. And people would sit in a parking lot across the street to watch her flaming figure coming to the front window trying to get out. Now, the follow-up is a girl from 1875. So this is in the range of when I think this woman had died. And I think this is the continuation of it and maybe the identification of the female ghost. Spiritual sewing on a machine, sawing wood, and etc. And this is from an article 1875 Times in August 3rd. In spite of modern skepticism, phenomena sometimes occurs even in these days of enlightenment, which are impossible to account for except upon the hypothesis of spiritual interference. To this class must be referred the mysterious noises which have been heard for some weeks nearly every night in a house on Cherry Street in this city, and which are vouched for by credible witnesses. Shortly after the death of Mrs. Kennedy, the house which she occupied was rented by a man named Goodwin, a shoemaker. In the middle of the night he was awakened by the sound of a sewing machine, apparently in the same room. The whir and rattle of the machine was followed by the noise like that of tearing a strip of domestic fabric, after which the machine would resume its work. Sometimes he would hear a sound of chopping wood, each blow of the axe being distinct. Then a noise of sawing wood, followed by the fall of the billet upon the floor. Night after night, for nearly 2 weeks, he heard those noises, and frequently got up to examine the house and find out the cause of the disturbance, but to no avail. Finally, he left the house, not as he said that he was afraid of ghosts, but he could not live without some sleep, and he could not sleep for the noise. Since he left, Mr. Brennan, who occupies the house next door, informs us that he has reportedly heard the noises, but has never been able to find out their cause. He says they have been of great service to him in one respect, for whereas formerly he could not leave a load of wood in his yard without having some stolen every night, he now enjoys perfect immunity from such theft. The locals have got the word out and the house is haunted, and they would no more dare to enter that yard or go near the house than they would to face the fiend himself. That is a good ghost story. Now, here we get to go into the weirder part of Chattanooga history, the forgotten history of spiritualism and voodoo. Now, spiritualism was a movement that began in 1848 in New York by two little girls, Maggie and Kate Fox, the Fox sisters. They lived in a house that was prone to knockings on the wall that would scare them. Well, when they got over being afraid, they started playing back and knocking back. And it began a communication, and they were able to start telling by code. But the spirit told them that it was a peddler, that he'd been killed, buried under that house. So they began tapping with him on tables, and he would tap on the table and talk to them. And that began the spiritualist movement. And if you don't know what that means, if you know of psychics nowadays, that's where it comes from. Because from that, they did the table tipping, table knocking, they would take it on tour. Then the Ouija board was created, which was a spiritualism device to communicate to spirits. It's not really meant to be a toy in a children's toy department. It's a spiritualist device to communicate with spirits. Out of the spiritualist movement, we still have psychics, we have metaphysical stores where you can go get readings, buy things, talk to your dead. And that's what that came from. So we still, today, are looking at psychics and everything who owe the Spiritualist movement to the Fox sisters back in 1848. They started that, and it started a religion that threatened to be huge, huge, and it threatened the other religions. It got kind of squashed because it was a threat. So then, during that period afterwards, the spiritualists made churches and made encampments. So you still have things like, I think it's Casadega in Florida. You can go to places where it's just a old little town of psychics. You can go to places where there's metaphysical stores in every city nearly. It all comes and stems from that. And to show you how big it was, Mary Todd Lincoln was a spiritualist. And when her son died, she was having seances in the White House. There were a couple that Abraham Lincoln accompanied her to placate her. But she was having seances in the White House. That's how far up it went. And one of the reasons it became really big is during the Civil War, when hundreds of thousands of young men went off and they just disappeared. They never came back. They were killed. They laid in fields. They were buried in pits. They didn't have dog tags to identify them. So they were just, if they died in a field, they were buried in a field and with no headstones. And so the mothers and fathers didn't know what happened to their children. The only way they could get some closure was to call the psychic, get a reading, find out how their child was doing to make sure that they were okay. It was very effective. And it was also a forerunner of the feminist movement. It was the first time in the country that women could make their own income by doing seancing, by talking to the dead, by doing readings, by doing table tippings. It was a freedom for women that was well needed. And so there it was. It's something that we forget because it was going to be a big religion. It almost became that. But like I said, it threatened the established churches, and they fought back. Here in the South, on Lookout Mountain, the spiritualists had bought a big property. Because if you go up and look at the Natural Bridge, they had bought the Natural Bridge. They had big buildings around on the property where all of these hundreds of psychics and followers could come, and they would have seances at the Natural Bridge with over 1,000 people at a time coming to these games. No cars, no electricity, I don't think. You had to go by train, or you had to go by horse or carriage. Thousands of people would come to these things, and it was a big deal. And a lot of psychics were in Chattanooga because of the spiritualist movement. In 1890, they were chased off by the KKK. That's what I've heard locally, and that's what I believe. They were a threat to what was established, and at that time, the KKK in the South was trying to rise up, and it was trying to take over everything. In Chattanooga, they tried to take over the churches. They tried to take over the banks. They tried to take over the schools. And eventually, people fought back and chased them down. So they didn't get to be as powerful as they wanted to be. They were like a little satellite thing out there. People knew it was there, but they didn't want it taking over their city. There were people that were against that kind of stuff. So it did exist, and it did have things, and they did awful things during that period. But all of it rose up at that same time, and then it all kind of died down at the same time. Spiritualism rose from the 1840s, really strong into the 1890s, and then it started to peter off because of Harry Houdini, who was an illusionist. He wasn't a spiritualist. He wasn't doing things spiritually, and he was threatened by spiritualism, and so he made it his mission to destroy them. And he did pretty well do that. He discredited a lot of people. Now, there's always going to be somebody in any religion who are charlatans. And there are plenty of those in every religion. But there are also people who are good. And there were good psychics. And there were people he could not trip up. So he would plant evidence to ruin them. And he ruined everyone he could ruin. And he ruined good ones. As you can tell today, there are psychics that are damn good, deserve to be listened to, and are wonderful. And then there are some that, not so much. He effectively tampered down that particular religion from becoming bigger. And they did make churches, and they do have encampments, so it does exist. But psychics owe a debt of gratitude to the Fox sisters and the spiritualist movement. But like I said, they created businesses. Now, we got to explain voodoo. Why is there voodoo in Chattanooga? Why are there 10 cases of voodoo in Chattanooga that I could find just by barely looking? Why? Well, let me tell you why. During the spiritualist movement in the 1840s, going up, people were real interested in talking to spirits. And it became very commonplace. Well, after the Civil War, the newly freed people that had been slaves had to find their own incomes to support themselves. To say the least, the South had rich people, but it also had a lot of poverty. There weren't great jobs to go around, and not great employers usually either. The people from these different countries, most of them had come into this country and ended up being whatever religion was around their area. So they would be like Baptist or Methodist or Catholic, and they just took those as their religion. But there were some people who brought religions from other countries. And some of these religions, which may sound familiar, some of them are voodoo, vodou, santeria. There are other kinds. There's all sorts of religions that have come and gone that they brought with them. They looked at what the spiritualists were doing, which they were making a living doing readings, talking to the dead, table tipping, doing all that stuff. Well, then the people with voodoo, they went, well, I can do that. So they started making a business out of doing readings, doing tarot, talking to the spirits, but they also, from their religion, they added magic and charms. So they could sell charms and spells and candles, and it evolved what the spiritualists started into another kind of business, which then has been adapted by other belief systems. Because nowadays you can go to almost any city, find a metaphysical store, where you go in a metaphysical store, get a reading, get a candle, get a spell, go to a seance. That all comes from those two movements. Psychics today still are kind of a throwback to the spiritualist movement, and people do all of that communication. They love all of it, and it actually is big entertainment on TV. But it actually is something that people come to personally to talk to the spirit world. And it all comes from that stuff. The part of doing the candles and the religion and all that stuff, the spells and the charms, comes from the added voodoo. It was a sign of empowerment for them as well as it was a women's movement, because they were able to rise to power. If people respected the doers. Now, see, let me tell you how much it is in the American psyche, whether you believe it or not. If I say voodoo, you're going to think Marie Laveau and voodoo dolls. That's because she was the high priestess of it. She is the queen of voodoo. And we all know what a Marie Laveau is. And we all know that that comes from New Orleans. We know that she was very powerful. There were people in Chattanooga. There was one that was called Old Aunt Lou. People really respected her and were afraid of her. But she had a great business going. And she could do spells. She was very good. I did read an article where a policeman who you could tell was a typical anti-everything person at that time in the 1880s. And he said that he wished that they were still burning psychics and fortune tellers at the stake. That's how much he hated that, because that was against his religion. But she was very powerful. They believed that she had a staff that she carried with her, that if she hit it on the ground, she could transport herself and time travel from one place to the next. That was how big stories were about her, that she was very powerful. If you wanted something done, you went to old Aunt Lou, who lived down off of 9th Street. There was a gentleman that was known that we don't know his name, but we knew he was a Boca. And when I was young and training, we called voodoo priests Bocas or practitioners. I don't remember where that came from, but that usually meant that they were accomplished practitioners. And he was supposed to be good enough to where if he was hired to put a spell on somebody or put a hurt, they would call it put a hurt on someone, they would hire him. He would go, and in those days, of course, it was in the 1880s. So you had to walk or ride the trolley or the train or ride a horse. And if you walked, he would know where you walked. So he would go and draw a line in the dirt in the street he knew you'd be walking home from. And when that person that was marked crossed that line, the spell would begin. That's how wicked this stuff would get. And there are stories of a man dying because a woman put a love spell potion that she got from a voodoo practitioner into this guy's drink, and it killed him accidentally. But he was killed by voodoo. And there was a doctor, there was a female doctor and an African American doctor, which, believe me, for the 1880s, that's an amazing story right there. They were together trying to fight people dying from voodoo because people were dying of fright. They would be targeted. They would find these fetishes in their beds with, dead people's fingers or dead people's toes and feathers, and they'd find them in their beds. They'd find them on their carriages. They would know they were being targeted, and they would just waste away and die. It was happening a lot. It was actually a kind of a phenomena at that time. And just to say this, there are voodoo practitioners that are very positive. It was actually a very positive religion. And when they came here with it, because there was so much hatred being thrown at the minority people, they used the aspects of voodoo that would give them a tool to strike back. There were plenty of people that needed to be zapped. Take my word for it. So I'm all for it on that part. But there were also people would hire them to zap that possibly did not deserve to be zapped, but they were in the way of someone else. So there are all of these very different stories going on, and we will cover those. But voodoo was a very important movement. It was along with the spiritualist movement, which was a women empowerment movement. It also was giving these people who didn't have a voice, because in our modern sensibilities, we go, if somebody did something to us, you'd go, oh, I'm going to go kick their butt. I'm going to get my gun. I'm going to go shoot them. Well, you couldn't do that. You had to shut up and take it. These people found a way to take care of business. And sometimes it took care of business a little bit better than most people understand. And another phenomena we will be covering, the old bocas, the ones that came directly from the countries, they had this intimidation factor that they knew how to do out of voodoo. That later on, the psychic phenomena, Western kind of thing, would go, it's a psychic phenomena of stones falling on houses. Well, it is a phenomena, but it's also an old, ancient voodoo intimidation factor. And we have a lot of stories of those. That was a practitioner who knew what they were doing. And there are a lot of stories of that in the 1880s. Then they kind of disappear in 1904, 1907. And I think that practitioner probably died. And when he died, the ability to do that faded away for the new practitioners. Amazing, amazing stuff. Amazing history that we just don't know. The thing with the spiritualist movement and the voodoo movement, it rose together. And then when Harry Houdini and the KKK and the churches and everything beating it down, it kind of disappeared around before the First World War. Now, with the spiritualist movement, it would come back up during the wars because people wanted to talk to their dead people. So it became big during World War One, during World War Two. And now it's back because we have shows. We have TV shows with psychics and all that doing that. But voodoo became more of a private thing. It always was kind of private and secretive. It's still secretive. You can still find practitioners, but if you go to New Orleans, you're going to go to the Marie Laveau Museum. And if you were an accepted person down there, you could go to a real voodoo ritual. It exists. It still has its existence. The spiritualist movement still has its existence. So now I've covered all of this so that you'll understand when I talk spiritualism or voodoo, what it really means, why we have it, why we need to know about it, because I'm not going to let it go by. It's a part of history. It's a part of our history. In a way, it's a part of empowerment for a people that were unable to speak out or to act out or to protect themselves directly. It's a very important, interesting issues. And I've got, like Kim Kardashian, I got the receipts and you're going to see it. So here we go. Alrighty. Our first story of voodoo is a man that was killed, supposedly, by voodoo powders. Now, the article is from the Times, August 5th, 1885. Now, in the 1880s, there was many voodoo stories, and they really were at their zenith in the 1890s. But the article says, was he voodooed? Suspicion of foul play in Prior Burnett's death. Dave Harper and Mary Thomas charged with the crime. So, what happened? He died of a suspicious illness, and the reason it was suspicious is because this woman had been talking about she wanted him dead because he started seeing another woman. She had given him apparently the money to start his business, and she got jealous when he started seeing another woman. So she started saying, I'll kill him before anyone else can have him. And at first she went to a voodoo priest and got love powders. And then she decided she didn't want love powders, she wanted dead powders. So she got a powder from somewhere, probably from the same place, and she slipped it to him. And he apparently died very painfully. He had infections in his abdomen, and it just was, he was throwing up, had a terrible fever, and for some reason they knew this other man was involved, Dave Harper. He was a barber. So they arrested those people, and they arrested the woman that he was seeing. And in the article, they were examining his intestines and stomach, and were going to give further notice. But because she had been blabbing her mouth, telling people she was going to kill him, and she wanted his money, that that's why she was sitting in jail. And they were really vicious toward each other toward the end. And but she just didn't say she wasn't guilty. And at that time in 1885, Burnett left about $2,500, which is pretty good, which would go to his mother. But this woman, Mary Thomas, even in jail, she was trying to put a claim on it. So, but she killed him because he was going to another woman, and she weren't going to have it. So that was handy for her to have powders to get the voodoo doctor to strike him out. The next article is very bad language for that time, so I'm not going to say it the way they put it. But this one is from 1889, and it was a man who was voodooed. His name was Franklin, and he was hurt by an enemy, and a voodoo priestess came to treat him. And what happened was he believed a man that was after him. The man that was the target was Cleo Franklin, and he lived with a doctor on the side of Cameron Hill, and what was Cameron Hill, and he was approached by a Times reporter after someone had told the reporter about this case. And the man was working downtown, had a good job at Loomis and Hart's, where he was making like $18 a week, which was a lot of money in the 1880s. All of a sudden, he started losing his appetite, strength, and he couldn't work. He had pains through his chest, especially through his heart. Sometimes his breast and stomach would swell to huge proportions. He had a sensation like chunks of ice were passing through his body, followed by numbness. He went to several doctors, but nobody could help him. And he was going to go to a faith doctor, one who cures by faith, by spirituality. And he was trying to find him when a woman told him where he was, but she says, "You can't do any good for you. You are hurt," which was the expression for bewitched in voodoo. And he let her try her treatment, and she gave him a bottle of liquid medicine, and in a few days she put a cup to his side, and the result was in the cup filled up with live frogs and worms and black bugs. And he stirred them around with a stick to show that they were alive. She took them away with her, but several people saw them. And he said, "I know how I got hurt. I had an enemy who put powdered frog and snake heads in my whiskey. These heads are dried and then ground up, and you will hurt anybody with this potion." And he said that the woman had cured hundreds, but he wouldn't tell her name. And he wouldn't tell where she was or anything like that. But every time that he would go for a treatment, even with people there, anytime she puts a cup up to his side, she pulls it away, and it's got worms and bugs and snakes and frogs. But anyway, he said he was feeling better, and he was having to go for another cupping remedy to free him from all of the stuff in his body. And that he was talking about the gentleman in town who could draw a line across the road, and everyone else could pass across it except for the person that it was named for or marked for, and when that person crossed it, then he would be hurt, which we had talked about that before. Witchcraft among Chattanooga seemed to bear the voodoo stamp, is what they said, and it dealt with reptiles and poison. Sometimes they feel like it embraced the most horrible observances and ceremonies in hidden places. Now, he wouldn't tell the name of the woman who was curing him, but they believed it was Eliza Johnson, and she had a good trade in amulets, charms, love potions, and they had people really respected her and wouldn't offend her for the world. And she, like Aunt Lou, had a crooked stick with which she could have absolute control over space and weather. She could transport herself from one place to another with this stick and can bring sunshine or rain at pleasure. And so that was something, she was a positive representation of voodoo because she was healing this boy, protecting him. The believers are both to talk of the mysteries of the occult science, but their faith is firm, and the present case will confirm them in their belief. The facts can be truly substantiated by either Franklin or Mr. Burke, in whose house he lives. That story was actually very positive. We're talking about a voodoo priestess who saw a man who had been hurt by another priest, took her steps to remove the evil from his body. So that was actually a positive representation of the voodoos and voodoo practitioners, because not everyone got smoked. But he was improving, so I would say that, after a couple more treatments, he was doing just fine. No more frogs or bugs to get out of him. Or that gives new meaning to the phrase, "Hey, do you have worms?" This next story of voodoo has another story attached to it that is from a famous case at that time that wasn't voodoo, but it's pretty warped. The one that is the voodoo story is from 1912, and it tells a story of mystery. Narrative puts Jack the Ripper in shade. Supernatural visitor baptizes him in blood. Well, before I tell you all about that, I have to go and explain to you the Ripper reference. Because in 1912, in Atlanta, there is a Atlanta Ripper who killed about 20 mulatto beautiful girls. Huge killing spree. And apparently, according to this article from March 11, 1912, he reforms them by murder. And Jack the Ripper says he will do much good. And so what was happening at the Times office, they began to get letters from the Atlanta Ripper who said he was going to come to Chattanooga and kill women, reform them by killing them. Thank God he didn't come, but at the end of his letter he signed it. Before I leave this city, you will find the conduct of girls and women is greatly improved. Jack the Ripper. It was actually a very serious scare, because at that time he was murdering women, at least up to 20 to 22 girls. So we started getting letters here, but thank goodness he did not come. Now, back to the voodoo story. They thought that this story put the Ripper story into the shade. And what happened with this in 1912? Yesterday, a woman came to the Times office to tell a strange story, which she avers Jack the Ripper had nothing to do with. Albert Merrill, living at 118 West Terrace, which was on Cameron Hill, has been subjected to terrible, unseen nightly visitors who cover his head with blood and otherwise terrify him. The thing, whatever it is, his sister-in-law said yesterday, announced his coming with a thunderous clapping of hands, and when awakened, the man was covered with streams of blood as cold as ice. The strange part is that there is never any cut on the man's face, and where the blood comes from is puzzling. Ora Henry, the sister, says, "We've all seen the blood, but none but Albert and Cora Merrill have heard the noise. The only way they can account for it," she says, "is that it's of supernatural power." Thrice is This bloody visitor baptized the man in goriness last July, November, and February 23rd just passed, thus before Jack the Ripper began his dark deeds. As evidence, the Henry woman brought along a pillowcase that was covered with bloodstains, one a print of a hand with a series of dots which formed letters reading, "Repent, the wages of sin is death." And then the hand has appeared among the stains each time. It is held, but the letters only in the last strange occurrence. They wished the story published in the hope that the invisible terror spirit would read it and be frightened away. The woman said Dr. G. Manning Ellis had examined the stains and testified to there being human blood stains all right. So that story, that man was being targeted through voodoo. He was in an enclosed place, closed doors, because I remember reading another story of this somewhere. There was no one able to get into the rooms. He was there with his wife, and they would hear the clapping. He'd wake up, and they'd be covered in blood. And this happened I think it happened a couple more times. So he was targeted to try and scare him to death, really. And it worked on several other people. So, but he lived on the side of Cameron Hill, where the other person lived. And Cameron Hill, if people don't know what that is, if you look up the hill, if you go west up from MLK Boulevard, go up the hill, and you'll see Blue Cross Blue Shield. So back in the 1890s, there was a big hill there. It was covered in mansions. There was a casino. There was trolley and all that stuff. And it was there were mansions all up it. And very pretty stuff. But it got cut down in the 60s for progress. And then a few years ago, Blue Cross Blue Shield cut it down another half. So, but that hill used to have old mansions on it, and that's where several of these stories are occurring up on the hill. This next story is very bizarre, and I have to really kind of break it down before I tell you the information in it. Because there are two people, a black witch doctor and a white witch doctor, who work together, and this article is in July 22nd, 1889, and it's titled Witchcraft, A Peculiar Partnership in Chattanooga. Well, what they're talking about, there's the African-American doctor, Dr. Jim Stanford, and the lady is Mrs. Julia Furman. And what this story is about, when they say witch doctor, when someone of the Western culture hears that, they go, ooh, that's a voodoo person or a witch doctor. No. In this case, what they're saying, these are two Christian doctors who are in the fight against voodoo. And they're Christian doctors, and they call them witch doctors, because they are helping the people who are being affected. And they are having people come to them that they do laying of hands on to remove the curses. When they do that, there was a man that came in and that had black-headed white snakes crawl out of his side. They had frogs and things that, when the people are being sick, you'll hear frogs and you'll hear all of this stuff going on. There was one woman that her stomach would flap and it would croak like a frog until she was laid upon hands, and then the frogs came out of her gut. There was a woman who came in who was possessed, and she fell into the floor when they put hands on her, and she went into a seizure, and a lizard came out of her ankle, and the woman was cured. These doctors are talking about that a lot of the servants at that time were the ones that were administering the curses. And they believed that a large amount of the trouble that was being caused that they were dealing with was by a woman named Betty King, who lived and died on Cherry Street. And she was a witch doctor, but she was also something else. Now, when in these cases they say witch, this is the Christian version of they just thought everything was a witch and everything was satanic. Well, witches, for the most part, really do not believe in a devil. That is a Christian belief system. So witches don't really believe that. They don't worship a devil. Voodoo practitioners are scared of people who list themselves as witches. They think that they're bad and the voodoo people are good. So they don't like witches. But they do not worship a devil either. They worship loas and they have different gods and things like that. But they don't have a worship of the Christian devil. And so these people, when they're talking about, these people are from hell and they worship Satan and they put curses on people, that's not exactly the truth, but that's the way they saw it. They had a friend, Dr. C.S. Wright, and he was keeping some of the witch things that people were bringing in, which were these feather fetishes and strange pieces of paper with feathers and coins on them, and some of them had fingers and toes that had been dug from a graveyard, and graveyard dirt, which was dug from a foot underneath the top of the grave. And I have seen people that talk about graveyard dirt. They use it, and it's meant to kill in magic. It is meant to kill. So if they used graveyard dirt, they meant for that person to be dead. These people, being called witch doctors, they were the ones that were helping the ones that were afflicted. They said that there was a woman the year before who had died from sheer fright. There was another one that went to a sane asylum, barking like a dog. There is another man who is wasted away and totally engulfed in fear and is like a walking skeleton. These people had been getting the poisons and the charms from Betty King, who is now dead. So now they were cleaning up her voodoo messes. But the fact that it was a African-American doctor, quote-unquote, and a white female doctor, quote-unquote, from the 1880s, it's an amazing story. And the fact that they took it so seriously, and they were there laying hands on people, trying to heal them in a Christian manner. And they believed that if they took the articles that were made to curse the people, they could throw them in the river, do a prayer, and it would turn back on the doer. Which sometimes it's a little bit more complicated than that. But that's the way they dealt with it. But they took it seriously. Several doctors were involved going, I don't believe in this stuff, but people are doing it. So it was a true problem in the 1880s. A true problem. These people were giving a solution to the people who were terrified. So that's all you can say. Our next story is, so down there around the 3rd Street. This article is from 1886, and it's about the Widow Brown's house. A profound mystery. The 3rd District excited over a strange event. And what this was, Widow Brown had a house that she rented out rents. This is 1886. And a lady, or a friend of hers, who was having trouble to get away from it, the woman came to take a room in Mrs. Brown's house so Mrs. Brown could take care of her. And she hadn't been there long, and apparently this woman was the target of a voodoo intimidation tactic. And while she was there, they began to hear noises on the outside of the house. The roof would rattle and the weatherboards pop with a sound like they were being rapped with a heavy stick. This was followed one night by a shower of stones, which, singular to relate, always came through the panes of glass, shattering them to pieces. This was only 2 or 3 nights ago. Mrs. Brown became alarmed and distressed at the great destruction of property, and the lady boarder also manifested uneasiness. The incidents of the evening were communicated to the neighbors the following morning, and a number of men armed themselves with guns and took up stations near the house by the adjoining woodland to watch for the cowardly person who was thus maliciously destroying the property of a lone widow and frightening her and her guests in so wanton a manner. Presently, the watchers were rewarded by hearing loud crashes from one of the windows, and every eye was strained to see who was the assailant and whence came the stones. No one could be seen. The glass breaking continued till every pane in the house was broken, and still no one could be found engaged in the cowardly business. Vigilant search was made in the woods for anyone who thought might be lurking in the vicinity, but all search was no avail, and the whole matter remains an entire mystery. Mrs. Brown is sorely distressed over the occurrence, which will cause her great financial loss. She knows of no one who has any grudge against her or who would do such a grievous harm. And one of the gentlemen who was present said that he could distinctly hear the shattering of glass, but could see no stone, nor could he hear any fall which might have been expected from the striking of the missiles on the floors or the walls of the house. Several huge stones were found inside the rooms, and several were laying just outside, but no one saw them thrown by anyone. Great excitement prevails in the neighborhood, and if the dastardly perpetrator could be found, he would meet with harsh treatment. A watch is being kept, and if the miserable scoundrel should attempt his work again, he will surely be detected and summarily punished. I have another article. $100 reward being offered for the person stoning houses on 9th Street. This was in April 29, 1883. The mysterious house stoning on 9th Street continues and is creating considerable excitement in that vicinity. It began Monday night and has continued every night since. T.S. Wilcox and G.W. Norman were the principal sufferers, and many panes were broken in their houses by the stones which were constantly thrown against them. The stoning grew so ferocious that Friday night that they had to remove their families. The houses are watched every night, and the pistols and guns fired whenever a stone is thrown, but this has failed to frighten the culprits. The most thorough search has been made for them, but it has proven entirely fruitless. The police are aiding and watching the houses, and last night, while a crowd surrounded them, the stoning began again, but its source remains a deep mystery. As will be seen elsewhere, a reward of $100 is offered for the apprehension of the perpetrators of this foul outrage. And then the next article, which is April 30th, 1883, a deep mystery. Rocks still fall from unseen quarter. Last night, a crowd of nearly 300 people gathered around the houses of Messrs. Wilcox, Wilbur, and Norman on Branham Street to witness the shower of rocks. This mysterious proceeding has attracted much attention, and people gather nightly to see the stones fall. At short intervals, rocks fell upon these houses. From whence they come is impossible to discover. Some of the missiles weigh 5 pounds and fall with a force which indicates that they descend a considerable distance. This matter is attracting much attention and is the source of much speculation. So, I also remember another story when I was young, that when these houses were being stoned, when it was raining stones on them, the rednecks would come and shoot at the rocks, which never helped. But these were people who were the targets of voodoo. They crossed somebody, so they hoodoo you voodoo when they voodoo you. This is about Old Aunt Lou, and this is 1881. And it's talking about Old Aunt Lou had given this man a potion and did a spell for him to make this woman fall in love with him, and she came from Texas and had to marry him, and now he was leaving her, and she went to old Aunt Lou to get a potion or get a spell to bring him back at first, and then she decided she don't want him, so she went to old Aunt Lou to put a curse on him, get rid of him, and let her be free. The police got involved. This is the article where the policeman said he wished that, like in the old days, they would still burn the old fortune tellers. And I thought, said by a very Christian man, very ugly. She just was doing her job, giving this woman work, and the policeman and the husband followed the woman and investigated the old Aunt Lou and tried to convince her that he wasn't trying to put a spell on her or didn't put a spell on her, and to try and keep her from continuing to try and pursue him with magic. But I can tell you, when they weren't looking, she went back and got it. Because, girls, when they want that spell, they're going to get that spell and zap that man. And so, I would say their marriage probably ended in death. They were dead before it was over. So, that's all I can say about that. When we're going through the aquarium property, we will go towards the part facing the river, and we will stand there, and I will tell you the river monster story in a minute, but I will also tell you what you're looking at. Down the street from us, down the river from us, is the Boathouse Restaurant. That used to be the site of Sitico Mound, which was a sacred mound. Indians from all over the country would come for at least over 3,000 years to come and visit that sacred site. And there were paths where the Indians had made that the missionaries set up on. These people came because that was a sacred mound. In 1915, the city decided they were going to cut it down. It was actually quite a beautiful tourist attraction. People begged them not to tear it down, and actually said it would only cost like $150 to just change the plan and leave the mound and just move the street over, but they refused. So, they bulldozed the mound down in 1915, and they believe they scraped the remains of at least 20,000 Indians into the river. During the excavations, they found a copper crown. They found skeletons, which I will show you pictures of. There is one I have of a woman that apparently had died in childbirth, and her twin baby skeletons are buried with her. And there's an elderly couple skeletons that are cuddled together, that are buried up above her head. And it's a beautiful sight and a very emotional picture. But at that time, nobody had any reverence for Indian remains. And so those skeletons, they said, were going into someone's private collection. To this day, they still, anytime they dig around on that property or in the streets near that, they find skeletons. Here near Chattanooga, in front of the aquarium, and anywhere that's been dug around there are bones that come from everywhere, because Indians are buried here all the way up past the Mississippians. They found on the little island that's out across from Hunter Art Museum out in the river, they found a sarcophagus in the early 1900s that had the skeleton, they said, of a person that was about 10 feet tall. At that time, archaeology believed that there were tall people like that, 8 and 10 foot tall, that used to live by the rivers. If you remember the story of the tall spirit in the white robe, that possibly could have been his skeleton. That might be a reason why he wanders in that area. But it was a fascinating place. The Indians found this place sacred. Cameron Hill, which was destroyed in 1960s, it was a great big mound and mountain. I mean, for here it was amazing. We had all sorts of mansions and stuff on it. But there also were a lot of legends about hidden gold, and there was a legend of a man who said that he found, in a hidden cave, he found 12 Indian skeleton mummies that were sitting up, surrounding one that had a copper crown on. At the Citico Mound, they did find a copper crown there, so there was something there, something interesting and unusual. And we don't know the history of why the Indians found this place so sacred, but they did. And then we came and we built on it and we scraped them into the water. I will show you the article from these children that found bones. And here it is. They were digging under their house on Orchard Knob, and they started finding bones. And what had happened is they had bought fill dirt for that property before that house was built. And they bought that fill dirt. Where did it come from? The mound of Citico Mound. They took that sacred dirt and used it as fill dirt. And these people were finding skeletons. And so they moved pretty quickly. My grandfather, my mother's father, Francis Bacon, when he was a construction worker in the early part of that century, he would have been working. He probably is one of them that plowed down the mound, because he did that kind of work. He said, but he said that there were places in Chattanooga where he would had to bulldoze, and people would follow behind the tractor, picking up bones, picking up pottery, arrowheads, whatever they could find. And instead of thinking of it as, it was grave picking, they saw it as, a tourist attraction. So all of this front of the aquarium and the front for the properties of the Hunter Art Museum and what used to be Cameron Hill, it's been cut down and it's gone. But all of that was sacred Indian ground. Where Wheelan Factory is down Broad Street, that was sacred. There was an Indian burial place out there and a poor people's burial place. And I knew someone, James Trollitt, who worked there at the Wheelan Factory as a guard. And he would say at night you could see the ghost of Indians running around, smudging, trying to cleanse the property of the people that were there. And Shirley Deakins told me 30 years ago that when she was a child, somewhere there on that property, there was a place you could go and take a piece of metal off this hole, and there was somewhere underneath the Wheelan property that they had hit a gas pocket, and it was lit, and so it was like an eternal flame. So but it was kind of underground, and they had something you could go and peek at it. So, I mean, we, as a white culture, have come in and built on sacred land. If you haven't watched any horror movies, that's usually not always a good thing to do. So that would cause spirit activity as well as just unusual warped energy. Because if it was sacred energy and ritual, then we're living in it. We're wallowing in it. We're building in it. Always remember, this place is sacred. The aquarium property has a fountain dedicated to Indians, and they have one that always has trouble working, and I always feel like that's probably because the Indians, it may, because they have different Indians listed, and it may be some of the Indian spirits going, well, maybe not so much. So Hopefully they'll get that straightened out. If they can't, they need to get a little shaman to come out and take care of this. But it's all sacred, all beautiful. I think the aquarium is a beautiful place, and I think it is just turned this city into a little jewel box. And they are trying to pay respect to the Indians, and the Indians had a lot of beauty to them, and I hope that we respect that and we take care of it. We are the inheritors of this very special place. It's a beautiful place to live. It's a beautiful place to visit, and it will continue to be so. But always treat it with care. Remember, the Indians considered this place sacred, so should we. Now, this one is a fascinating story. River Monster, from an article in July 2nd, 1885, a startling reminiscence of early days. The Tennessee River above Chattanooga was the sporting ground of an immense serpent, the sight of which was the precursor of death. Living witnesses of the fact. As far back as 1820, the Indians arriving at Dallas on trade expeditions told wonderful tales about a huge serpent which made this part of the river his sporting ground. And again, the sudden death of some red man who had seen the monster confirmed the saying among them that no one could look upon the serpent and live through the season. Many of those who saw the monster described it as having a huge head, 2 feet in length, resembling a dog, with livid and contorted countenance and frothing lips. The body is said to have been from 20 to 25 feet long, and from the middle of the slimy back an ugly fin projected above the water when the serpent was in motion. It was shy at times and would not be seen for more than a year, during which periods it is supposed to have hibernated or to have visited some foreign stream. There are not many now living who saw the monster, but some few remain to tell the story to their grandchildren, and others survive who heard their parents tell of it, and all have mentioned here are either now well known where they live, or, if dead, are remembered in their neighborhoods as reliable persons. Buck Sutton saw it in 1822. He was fishing in a place called Van's, named after an old Indian, and located on the present site of Harrison. He said that the serpent was 25 feet long. That summer, Sutton died. In 1827, Billy Burns was crossing the river at Van's when the monster nearly upset his canoe. He said it appeared to be long as the canoe. It was yellow on the belly and blue on the back. After that, Burns seemed to be afflicted in some strange manner, and that summer he died. Jim Wyndham was fishing on a jut of rocks below Dallas in 1829 when he saw the monster slowly pass him, not more than 10 feet away. It rolled up on its side and gave him a keen look, then seemed frightened and fled. The back fin stood out of the water 2 feet high, and the back of the serpent measured fully 2 feet across. Wyndham did not live till the crops were laid by. The father of Judge Puckett saw the monster in 1826 when it supposed its hurtful powers had begun to wane, for he and others who afterwards saw it, including Joe Van's slaves, escaped with their lives. Mrs. Sally Wilson and her husband J.C. Wilson, both of whom now live not far from Ray Springs in Ray County, saw the monster at different times. She went to the river near Shoemaker Place to get water, and says she saw the serpent, which seemed as long as a canoe. Her husband, known by the Indians as Lease or Hanging Bird, is now 84 years old. He saw the prodigy in 1839. He was standing on the south side of the river above Chickamauga Island, and says he saw it in a playful mood, sporting in the water toward the north shore. Its back was 1.5 feet out of the water, and it left a frothy serpentine wake behind. When disturbed, it darted with incredible speed and was not more than a minute in crossing the river. This is the last authentic account given of the serpent. The steamboats began to run on the river about 1830, and it was seen less frequently in the later years. It was probably driven out of the stream altogether, but its reappearance was constantly dreaded for a score of years, and it did not cease to be a talk of wonderment and conversation for more than a generation. Alrighty, this is going to be the last part of our tour, and we're going to the absolutely beautiful Hunter Art Museum, and it is stunning, 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 stunning. I remember coming here on a school visit back when I was in first grade in 1968, and it was a gorgeous Christmas tree from around the world exhibit, and I remember one that was covered, it looked like spider webs. It was just absolutely beautiful place, and I was fascinated with it, and I really wanted to come back to it a lot more than I have. But before we start the story of the Hunter Art Museum, on the street that comes up to it, High Street, Georgia, and all that down there, in 1880, October 21st, a ghastly discovery. There was a 3rd Street discovery. They were digging up the road, and they dug up a coffin of a man. And he still had some white hair and gold teeth. And apparently in the 1880s, they discovered that there was a cemetery that had been there from, it had closed about 1830. And so they just made roads over it. So 3rd Street, High Street, Georgia, and all that, there are places up there where they find bones and coffins and things when they do street work, even this long along. I mean, there are skeletons everywhere in Chattanooga. But anyway, we are going to go to the Hunter Art Museum, gorgeous place. And in 1990s, when I did the show for WTCI's Southern Accents, we did room 311. We visited the museum in October 1999. Frank Riddle, a friend of mine at the time, had arranged to come and look at the Hunter Art Museum with WTCI. And we were taken on a tour by the museum's administrator, Eileen Henry. I was very, very surprised they let us in, but we did. And it was for a Halloween special. So we quickly did our tour, and everyone was very pleasant. But, you know, there were some people, there was a place we were at where there was a staircase that went down, a kind of a curve. I think it was a curved staircase. It went down. They were kind of excited, but they were also going, ooh, isn't this spooky? There was one of the people there with me that said, I don't believe in ghosts, but I sure am afraid of them. And we started in the place at a staircase, like I told you. One of the ladies asked me, said, well, do you see any ghosts? And I looked down, and at that time, I was seeing this very pretty maid. You could tell she was wearing an old maid's costume. It was like a black watercress taffeta, black servant's dress with a little lace cap and a little long apron. And I said, yes, I can see her. She's at the bottom. And if you go down there, you know, you'll fill her energy spot. So the lady ran down, went to the spot I said, screamed, and ran back up. So everybody had to go down the steps, just, you know, and test it out. And I was there mainly, to begin with, to meet Augusta Hoffman. Frank had found some of the story, and so we went to see her, and I went to investigate her, because she had been part of an international scandal, really. And her house used to be in the parking lot. It was an old Victorian cottage. She had been a modiste, I think is what they call it, like a tailor or seamstress. And she worked at Molly McGuire's on 17th Street until she disappeared in 1915. Miss Hoffman had two sisters, Mrs. Parker, who lived in Pennsylvania, and another sister who lived in Knoxville. Miss Hoffman was going to go see her sister that lived in Knoxville, and she had said she was going to withdraw a large amount of money because she had a distrust for banks. She disappeared. She was dressed for a trip to the Knoxville sister, and according to local reports, that was the last time Augusta was seen alive, in 1915. At the time of her disappearance, Miss Hoffman shared her home at 15 Bluffview with her aunt and uncle, the Bennetts of Rome, Georgia. The Bennetts were known to the local authorities as an unsavory couple who had previously been convicted of forgery. For 10 years after her disappearance, the Bennetts lived in the house but failed to file a missing persons report on their niece. See what had happened? She had loaned her uncle a great deal of money. Apparently, he wasn't able to pay it back, so she was going to get that money out of him by getting free rent. And so she moved in that house with them, and it really signed her death warrant. In 1925, 10 years after she had disappeared, nobody knew where she was. These people had not filed a report. And it was found that during the time after she left, there was a huge problem with a terrible smell coming from the house. And the Bennetts were always saying, well, it's the sewer, it's this, it's something else. And eventually it went away. But after a while, they moved from that house. So in 1925, some repairs were made to 15 Bluffview. Upon removing the flooring, the workers discovered the grisly remains of a female, bludgeoned to death with several blows to the back of her head. Her body had been found forced into the crawl space, covered with a cape soaked in acid of ammonia and ashes. It was determined she was between 45 and 47 years old, and her expensive dentures were manufactured in Europe. With the discovery of the grisly remains, the police charged the Bennetts with murdering Augusta for the amount of the missing bank money of around $600. The missing socialite's murder made national headlines. From Los Angeles to New York, papers reported on the upper-class lady slain by her greedy relatives. Based on circumstantial evidence, the couple was initially convicted of manslaughter. Upon appeal, the evidence against the Bennetts was considered too weak, and the case was dismissed, so they got off with murder. Officially, Mrs. Hoffman's murder or murderers have never been legally determined, but these people sat in that house with it stinking from her corpse for months. It was them. But they weren't able to get them, and they got out of it on a technicality. So, what was happening? That property was in the parking lot. And when the Hunter Art Museum was built and everything, in the 70s, or late 60s, I think, they tore down all of those houses and made parking lots for the Hunter. And then the Hunter started being haunted by this woman. And the people who would come in to clean it would see this woman sitting there with blood all over her, sitting very primly in a chair, just covered, bludgeoned, just a bloody mess. So people were scared to work there sometimes. And so when I went in, I wanted to communicate with her directly. Where the beautiful staircases come down and curve, You can have mirrors and stuff up there by them. But it's a beautiful setting. And I went in and I started seancing. And she appeared, but she was she didn't want to show herself as a bludgeoned, bloody woman. She was sitting there in this really nice white blouse and a long black skirt of that period, and her hair all done up, and she wanted to appear dressed up. And she just was telling me that she liked that building, and she liked coming there. And when they tore down her house, she didn't have anywhere else to visit at the moment, so she just moved into the Hunter. Not long after we had done our investigation, a friend of mine came up and said there had been a psychic who came in there before all this, who ran up to Eileen Henry and had said, there's a woman buried under the floor, her ghost, so that's what that was. The corpse that was found in the house. So she may have died in 1915, but she's still perky and real and very viable to this day. So we had a nice exchange, but she didn't care to move on. She just was very comfortable and loved that property and likes it. She's not trying to scare people, but when they see her, sometimes she forgets, that she looks like she does. And she thought, during our conversation, she chose to discuss her current existence rather than the more gruesome aspects of her demise. She found the Hunter Art Museum to be peaceful, generally quiet. As a former modiste, she found the changes in women's clothing over the decades to be quite extraordinary and somewhat shocking. I gave thanks to her and let her go, and we went through the Hunter, and there was a parlor with a bay window that once overlooked the luxurious homes of Chattanooga's wealthier citizens. And standing at the window was the spirit of a portly, dark-haired man in an old-fashioned charcoal gray three-piece suit, and I felt his excruciating pain from either stomach problems or cancer. And he was overly focused spirit, and to calm himself, he would stand and peer out the bay window for hours. The description I gave of the gentleman confirmed that he was Mr. Hunter himself, a Coca-Cola magnate, who lived in a house at 10 Bluffview and the current location of the Hunter Art Museum. Being a bachelor, Mr. Hunter bequeathed this house to the city of Chattanooga in 1952 with the specific intent that the home would become a museum. And the Hunter Museum expanded its property beyond the original house in 69 or 70. That's when they tore down Mrs. Hoffman's former house at 15 Bluffview. According to Hugh McClellan, past president of Provident Insurance Company, patrons of the Hunter Art Museum told of moving pictures, slamming and opening doors, and other paranormal activities. Since neither Mrs. Hoffman or Mr. Hunter seemed to be destructive spirits, we continued our exploration of the museum. It was very interesting. They took me to the basement. In the basement, I could see all sorts of different servants, spirits. It was very strange. There were rooms. There was a room with an older man laying there like he was sick. I saw the maid again. She seemed to be taking care of him or watching over him. There was a prison cell down there. Nobody knows what that was for. And I thought, well, it's probably where they put their wine to keep people from stealing it, or they might have been just a little kinky somewhere. We just don't know. We had a good time looking through that, and right as we were getting to leave, a lady from the third floor came down, just furious, thinking we had been up there in her office, and asked her, why have we messed up her office? And we said we hadn't been up there. And she was shocked. And so we went up there, and I'm telling you, it looked like a miniature tornado had wrecked that office area. Pictures were knocked down, papers, objects littered the desktop, a fan had been thrown over. A frustrated, angry lady spirit who resided there felt we were ignoring her because we were going to leave without talking to her. She just was showing her herself, so we would know that she was here, acknowledge her. She found a physical way to let us know that she too haunted the historic confines of the Hunter Art Museum. So we went up and saw it. What was told about the slamming doors and all those pictures and everything and messing, that's her. She's on the third floor. She's when she goes off, she goes off. But Mrs. Hoffman, Mr. Hunter seemed to be very calm. They loved the atmosphere of the Hunter, and they want to live there forever and ever, and I think that they will. It's a beautiful place, so why not? Well, now, I hope you enjoyed this here ghost tour on the dark side of Chattanooga. This is the first tour of its kind that I have ever seen of an online ghost tour. So you heard it from the horse's mouth. And I said mouth. Now, I will be doing other ghost stories about Chattanooga, like Green Eyes and Soap Sally and Haunted Sherman Heights and ghost stories from Cameron Chills. I mean, so there's all sorts of different things that I'm going to do about Chattanooga that will be on YouTube, along with my show, the Fat Psychic Cooking Show, where I will cook you a meal and then tell you a ghost story at the end. And it's bound to be lots of fun. And so I want you to keep on coming back. And if you'll hold on for a minute after this is over, look at the books that I have available on Amazon that I have written myself or co-written with Teal Gray and Sin Schrader Hill. Just keep checking back and we'll find other things to keep you entertained. So, y'all have a good night. See y'all later. Come back now. You hear?